2023 here in Washington could be summarized just as much by what didn't happen by what did. The year began with gridlock on Capitol Hill when House Republicans took 15 rounds, remember that, of voting to select Kevin McCarthy as their speaker. Then fast forward to October, and some in his own party kicked him out. Beyond the speakership drama, this year's Congress failed to pass a long-term government funding bill. They made no real bipartisan progress on border security, and they didn't pass new end-of-the-year funding for both Ukraine and for Israel. Well, CBS News senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe joins us now. Ed, you've been wrapping up the year with us here in the office. Now we can do it on America Decides. What should we expect from the White House in 2024 based on what happened over the past year?
Well, they're going to have to finish all the unfinished business. Once again today, a reminder of how acute the border crisis has become, with another 10,000 apprehended yesterday, and now a feud brewing between the White House and the Speaker over what exactly the president can and should be doing about the situation. It's a reminder that that issue of border security and immigration policy sits in the middle of that broader debate over how exactly to ensure funding for the ongoing wars in Ukraine and Israel and other issues around the world that the president's been seeking. So with Congress set to come back in early January, and with talks continuing between Republican and Democratic senators and the White House about a potential deal, the Speaker today throwing down the gauntlet, saying the president should be restoring the Remain in Mexico program that forced migrants to stay in that country while they were seeking asylum in the U.S. They should be able to more quickly round up those that are not seeking asylum and are here illegally. In essence, trying to shut down the border through U.S. policy and force the president to do that. The White House says they've done everything they can on the issue. The Speaker's office turns around and says, no, they haven't, and that's insulting to the American people.
Ed, if you could take off your White House correspondent cap for just a moment and remember when we were reporters together on Capitol Hill studying the leadership in both chambers. And we know that President Biden has a close relationship with Senator McConnell, the Republican leader in the Senate. But what's your read, what's your assessment about President Biden's relationship with the new Speaker, Mike Johnson, and how that could play out in the coming year? What are you really watching on that front?
Well, it's almost non-existent as far as we can tell, right? And these are guys that had met one other time before they had their formal conversations right after Johnson became Speaker. And they probably need to get together and, break bread or at least have a long meeting together and get to a sense of each other's policy priorities and a little more about themselves personally. The problem is they don't want to put the president in a room with a guy who may or may not be Speaker in a few weeks, depending on how things go, because there's that threat. They don't want to put him in the room because this is a guy who wants to at least support an ongoing inquiry into impeaching him and supported the former president's push to stay in office even though he'd lost the election. So, in some respects, the White House doesn't mind the distance now between the White House and Republican congressional leadership, because as we get closer to an election, they can sit there and go, well, see, it's their fault, and you shouldn't be lumping us in with an inactive Republican Congress. But for a president who, as you say, has valued his relationships with people like Mitch McConnell, you'd think he'd want to have one with the Speaker. And we asked again today, and they said, no, there's no plan for them to meet. There's no plan for them to get together in the new year and try to hash this out as normally a Speaker and a president might be able to.
Ed, dig into that a little bit more for us. So if the president is not going to be directly engaging very much with the new Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, who should we be watching in terms of who can be the deal makers on Capitol Hill with this administration? Who in the Senate, who maybe even in the House, are going to be able to craft the contours of a deal on immigration, on the border, on Ukraine funding, on Israel? If it's not going to be the president and the Speaker, who's it going to be?
Right now, the three most critical negotiators among senators are Chris Murphy, the Democrat of Connecticut, Kirsten Sinema, the independent from Arizona, and James Lankford, the Republican of Oklahoma. They've taken the lead on that piece that most of the Senate believes if you can figure that out, everything else is gravy and should move pretty quickly. What happens once it goes to the House? That's a good question, and we don't entirely know. The White House doesn't know. Congressional leadership doesn't seem to know. At least Senate leadership doesn't know quite how it would go in the House. And that's the big unknown going into next year is, okay, let's say the Senate does pull it off and pass something quickly with a looming partial government shutdown coming in mid-January. What happens when it all goes over to the House remains a big mystery, in part because we don't know to what extent Speaker Johnson has true read or control of his conference. We don't know what parts of that conference might really revolt and over what aspects of that deal they might revolt over.
Is Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut, the Democrat, does he have the full blessing of the White House to kind of be the point man for Democrats, or is he more of a lone ranger?
No, he seems to have it. They wouldn't have the Homeland Security Secretary, the White House Chief of Staff, engaged in those ongoing talks and helping him and the other negotiators with the details of, well, if we do this, what does this mean? If we do that, what does it mean? If they didn't trust him. More importantly, he also has Leader Schumer's backing and blessing to sort it out, because he's just decided to take it on and believes with Senator Langford and Senator Sinema they can try to get something done. And Murphy's somebody that the White House has consulted before, because he's somebody who's got a foreign policy portfolio, obviously takes great interest and concern on issues like gun control. President likes him. He's met with the president a few times and keeps in touch with him. So yes, in essence, he is negotiating this on behalf of the White House and most of the Democratic caucus, but of course progressives in the House, Latino lawmakers, or other border state Democrats have some concerns about what may ultimately be negotiated, and we'll see how it goes.
Fascinating reporting from Ed O'Keefe, the person to watch, that where the power seems to be, at least in part, Senator Chris Murphy. Ed O'Keefe, thanks for all those insights. We appreciate it.